In the autumn of 1941, the British Royal Air Force concluded their extensive evaluation of a radically new American fighter aircraft. The verdict delivered by the test pilots was absolutely brutal. They called the machine a complete operational disaster. They stripped the aircraft of its Royal Air Force camouflage and immediately sent the remaining units back to the manufacturer. The United States Army Air Forces shared the exact same grim sentiment. To the Western Allies, the Bell P-39 Airacobra was nothing more than a flying coffin. It was sluggish and dangerously unresponsive at high altitudes. It was considered a mechanical dead end that had no place in a modern war. But history is rarely shaped by perfect machines. It is shaped by the harsh environments that consume them. Because while the West threw the Airacobra into the scrap heap of aviation history, the Soviet Union took that exact same machine and turned it into the deadliest meat grinder of the Second World War. Look at the historical balance sheet. Of the top Soviet fighter aces who survived the war, more than half achieved their most lethal kill streaks while sitting inside the cockpit of this rejected American plane. Alexander Pokryshkin scored approximately 48 of his 59 confirmed kills in it. Grigory Reshkolov scored approximately 50 of his 56 confirmed kills in it. Dmitry Glinka scored 50 confirmed kills flying it. How does a piece of engineering garbage become the weapon of choice for the most ruthless hunters on the Eastern Front? This is not just a story of a misunderstood machine or a lucky coincidence. This is a forensic audit of aerodynamics, logistical logic, and the brutal mathematics of frontline survival. To understand the paradox of the Airacobra, you must first understand the fundamental illusion of the Western Air War. We call this the altitude trap. In 1941, the American and British military doctrines were completely obsessed with the stratosphere. They envisioned a future war fought exclusively at 20,000 feet and above. The massive 4-engine bomber streams required high-altitude escorts to survive the flak and enemy interceptors. Every engine, every wing frame, and every supercharger was designed to breathe in the thin, freezing air of the upper atmosphere. And this is exactly where the P-39 suffered its fatal diagnosis. To save production costs and streamline mass manufacturing, the Americans had made a calculated compromise. They removed the turbo supercharger from the aircraft's Allison V-17T engine. Without that vital mechanical component, the Airacobra simply could not breathe above 15,000 feet. Its engine choked on the thin air. Its climb rate plummeted drastically. It became a sitting duck for any German Messerschmitt operating in the vertical plane. The West looked at this high-altitude performance and declared the entire system a failure. They assumed that because the aircraft failed their specific tactical requirement, it was universally useless across all theaters of war. This was a massive operational blind spot. They evaluated the weapon based on a single environmental condition. When the United States began shipping thousands of Airacobras to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, they did not do it out of premium generosity. They were offloading excess inventory that they deemed unfit for their own elite pilots. They sent the plane into the meat grinder of the East, assuming it would be quickly consumed by the technologically superior Luftwaffe. But the Western planners fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the war happening in Russia. The Eastern Front was not a war of strategic, high-altitude bombing campaigns. It was a war of mud, steel and blood. It was a tactical war of ground support, tank busting and frontline annihilation. The Red Army needed aircraft to protect the heavily armoured Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovix as they hammered German panzers. On the Eastern Front, the sky was not 20,000 feet high. The entire aerial war was fought below 10,000 feet. It was fought at treetop level, over burning villages and frozen rivers. It was fought in the dense, thick air, where oxygen was plentiful, and where the standard rules of aerodynamics changed entirely. And in this specific brutal environment, the missing turbo supercharger did not matter at all. In fact, its absence made the aircraft significantly lighter and less complex to maintain in the freezing mud. This brings us to the true mechanical reality of the Airacobra. When you strip away the Western high-altitude bias, you see a machine that was years ahead of its time. The engineers at Bell Aircraft had made a radical design decision that defied all conventional logic. Instead of putting the massive engine in the nose like every other fighter of the era, they placed it in the middle of the fuselage, right behind the pilot. It was the exact same mid-engine layout used in modern supercars to achieve perfect weight distribution. At low altitudes, this specific center of gravity gave the P-39 an unparalleled ability to roll, dive, and change direction instantly. It was no longer a sluggish high-altitude escort. Below 10,000 feet, it became an absolute beast of prey. The Luftwaffe pilots operating the legendary Bf-109 were completely unaware of this tactical and mechanical intersection. They flew into Russian airspace carrying the deep arrogance of their high-altitude supremacy. They had crushed the air forces of Poland, France, and the Low Countries. They genuinely believed the Soviet pilots were untrained amateurs riding flying tractors. The German doctrine relied on rigid formations and energy fighting from the glare of the sun. They expected to dive on helpless targets and climb away without facing any real consequence. They believed their superior altitude would always dictate the terms of engagement. But when they dove down into the thick air of the Russian steppes to hunt the Soviet ground attack planes, they entered a totally different reality. They entered the Airacobra's domain. The rules of engagement were suddenly rewritten. The altitude trap had been sprung, and the hunters were about to become the hunted. It took a specific type of mind to unlock the true violence of the Airacobra. Enter Alexander Pokryshkin. He was not just a fighter pilot. He was a tactical architect who analyzed air combat through the cold lens of physics and geometry. While the Soviet High Command was still clinging to outdated defensive circles, Pokryshkin was writing a completely new manual. His worn notebook was filled with complex mathematical equations, calculating kinetic energy, dive angles, and gravitational pull. He realized that the American aircraft was fundamentally misunderstood by its original creators. It was exceptionally heavy, yes, but in physics, mass combined with gravity equals devastating terminal velocity. Pokryshkin invented a relentless tactical system known as the Kuban scissors, or simply the pendulum. Instead of fighting the aircraft's weight, the Soviet aces weaponized it. They would position themselves above the German flight paths, remaining stealthy in the sun's glare at medium altitudes, and then execute screaming vertical dives. The heavy Airacobra would slice through the Luftwaffe formations like a falling steel guillotine. Before the German pilots could even react to the sudden loss of their wingmen, the Soviet fighters would use their accumulated kinetic energy to zoom violently back up into the vertical plane. They repeated this brutal pendulum motion until the sky was entirely cleared of enemy aircraft. The Bf-109 was a magnificent energy fighter, but it could not match the structural diving speed and the terrifying low-altitude agility of the mid-engine American machine. This aggressive tactic was amplified by another overlooked mechanical anomaly. Because the massive Allison engine was mounted completely behind the cockpit, the nose of the P-39 was incredibly sleek and low. It lacked the giant, vision-blocking engine cowling found on almost every other fighter of the era. For the Soviet pilots, this meant absolute, unobstructed forward visibility. They possessed a perfect panoramic view of the chaotic battlefield below them. In the swirling dogfights of the Eastern Front, seeing the enemy a fraction of a second earlier was the absolute difference between life and death. The Airacobra pilots were not just flying blindly into combat zones. They were predatory snipers with a flawless field of vision, picking off their targets before the Germans even registered the incoming threat. But the mechanical advantages did not stop at pure aerodynamics. There was a third nail driven into the coffin of the Luftwaffe, and it was a purely logistical one. History often romanticizes the turning points of battles, falsely attributing them to raw courage or superior speed. But in reality, warfare is heavily dictated by communication systems. In the early years of the war, the vast majority of Soviet fighter aircraft were completely blind and deaf. They simply did not have two-way radios installed. Soviet pilots were forced to rely on frantic hand signals and wing waggles to coordinate their attacks in the middle of a firefight. It was an archaic, chaotic system that led to massive, unnecessary casualties. When the Airacobras arrived from the American factories, they brought something utterly revolutionary to the frozen airfields. Every single P-39 was equipped with a state-of-the-art, highly reliable two-way radio system. This simple piece of technological logistics fundamentally altered the DNA of the Soviet Air Force. Pokryshkin used these radios to transform his squadrons from a collection of isolated individuals into a singular, highly coordinated organism. They became a synchronized, telepathic wolf pack. They could call out targets, warn each other of ambushes, and execute complex multi-layered attacks with terrifying precision. The German pilots, who had previously exploited the disorganized nature of the Soviet formations, suddenly found themselves being systematically hunted by an enemy that operated with a collective hive mind. And then came the final, most devastating mechanism of destruction. The forensic examination of the Airacobra's lethality always leads back to the dead center of its propeller hub. Because the engine was located in the rear, the entire forward section of the aircraft was hollowed out. The American engineers used this empty space to install an absolutely monstrous weapon system. It was the Oldsmobile M4 37mm cannon. This was not a standard machine gun. It was a piece of flying artillery firing directly through the center of the propeller axis. The weapon had a notoriously slow rate of fire and extremely limited ammunition. American and British pilots hated it because they could not hit small, fast-moving targets at high altitudes where the plane vibrated violently. But at low altitudes against heavily armored German bombers like the Heinkel He 111 or the Junkers Ju 88, it was the Grim Reaper itself. A standard fighter aircraft might require hundreds of machine gun rounds to critically damage a heavy bomber. The Airacobra only needed exactly one. A single 37mm high-explosive shell possessed enough kinetic trauma to completely sever the wing or rip the entire tail section off a German aircraft. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe crews was absolutely paralyzing. They were flying massive war machines that could be instantly vaporized into a cloud of burning aluminum by a single trigger pull from a despised, supposedly useless American fighter. The post-action reports from the Eastern Front contain a staggering amount of evidence regarding the psychological collapse of the German fighter squadrons. When the German intelligence officers first briefed their frontline units about the Airacobra, they dismissed it as a slow, unmaneuverable target practice drone. But the reality of the Kuban air battles completely shattered this arrogant assumption. Captured Luftwaffe veterans described the absolute horror of engaging Pokryshkin's units. They reported that the Soviet pilots were no longer fighting like isolated, confused individuals. They were operating with the cold, mechanical precision of a single predatory entity. The German pilots found themselves trapped in a terrifying vertical blender. Every time a Messerschmitt attempted to execute a standard climbing maneuver to escape, an Airacobra would materialize out of the sun's glare, its 37mm cannon already firing. The sheer kinetic impact of that massive projectile hitting a German airframe was so violent that it defied standard aerodynamic survival. There was no gliding back to base. There was no emergency landing. There was only instant, catastrophic structural disintegration, but this unprecedented lethality did not come without a horrific human cost. The narrative of the Airacobra is not a sanitized tale of mechanical perfection. It is a deeply tragic forensic study of the price paid for aerodynamic radicalism. The very same design choice that made the P-39 a supernatural dogfighter also made it a notoriously treacherous widowmaker. The mid-engine configuration created a highly sensitive and extremely precarious center of gravity. To maintain the aircraft's balance, the heavy ammunition for the 37mm cannon and the nose-mounted machine guns acted as crucial counterweights. But as the pilot engaged the enemy and expended his ammunition, the nose of the aircraft became progressively lighter. The center of gravity shifted dangerously backward towards the tail. If a Soviet pilot pulled the control stick too hard during a violent low-altitude dogfight with empty ammunition bins, the aircraft would instantly violently snap out of control. It would enter a catastrophic aerodynamic stall known as a flat spin. Unlike a standard spin, a flat spin resembles a falling leaf spinning horizontally. There is no airflow moving over the control surfaces to allow the pilot to recover. The aircraft simply drops out of the sky while spinning uncontrollably like a brutal centrifuge. And this is where the unique structural design of the Airacobra became a literal death trap. Unlike standard fighter planes that featured a sliding canopy that could be easily jettisoned, the engineers at Bell Aircraft had installed automotive-style side doors. During a violent flat spin, the intense aerodynamic pressure and the massive centrifugal forces pinned these car-style doors permanently shut. The pilot was entirely trapped inside a spinning metal coffin, fully conscious, as the ground rushed up to annihilate him. Hundreds of brave Soviet aviators did not die from German bullets or anti-aircraft fire. They died because they could not escape the unforgiving physics of their own machines. They were consumed by the very beast they were trying to tame. This was the brutal reality of the Soviet war machine. They accepted the horrific mortality rate of the flat spin because the mathematical trade-off was ultimately favorable. They sacrificed a percentage of their own pilots to the machine's fatal flaws in exchange for a weapon that could systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe. Now, let us examine the final forensic ledger of this historical paradox. The balance sheet of the Airacobra is written in cold, uncompromising numbers. The United States shipped nearly 5,000 of these rejected aircraft to the Soviet Union through the freezing logistics routes of Alaska and Siberia. In the hands of the Western Allies, the plane achieved virtually nothing of strategic significance. In the hands of the Soviet Air Force, it became the highest-scoring American-built fighter aircraft in Soviet service during the entire Second World War. It generated more aces, destroyed more enemy aircraft, and shattered more German armored columns than any other imported machine on the Eastern Front. It proved that the intrinsic value of a weapon cannot be measured in a vacuum or tested in a sterile environment. A machine is only as lethal as the doctrine that commands it and the environment that shapes it. The Western planners failed because they allowed their rigid high-altitude ideology to blind them to the raw, violent potential of their own creation. The Soviet commanders succeeded because they stripped away all the theoretical illusions and applied pure logistical logic to a desperate situation. They looked at a flawed, dangerous, rejected piece of hardware and saw the exact mechanical properties needed to win a war of annihilation. Behind every great military victory, there is a hidden mechanism, a misunderstood technology, and a tragic human cost. The story of the P-39 Airacobra is the ultimate testament to the men who rode a flawed monster into hell and forced the devil himself to surrender. What are your thoughts on this brutal paradox of military engineering? Does your family have any stories, historical documents, or different perspectives on the forgotten weapons of the Eastern Front? Share your historical insights in the comments below. If you value this type of objective, forensic military analysis, make sure to subscribe and engage with our content. Because history is never just about the machines we build, but the terrifying logic we use to deploy them.